I played every main Fallout game. Here's my thoughts. This is probably one of my most requested videos, and I think it's finally time we took a look. Fallout is a series of post-apocalyptic role-playing games. Most people nowadays are familiar with the Bethesda and Obsidian Fallout games, but the series actually began in the late 90s. Originally, the games were developed by Interplay Productions, but starting with 3 onward, they were developed exclusively by Bethesda. Well, except for 1, but we'll get to that. Before we start though, I need to mention 3 things. First, I really want to thank my patrons for supporting the channel. These people include Melancholis in the Omega Gamer tier, and That's Just Ash and Meg Luke Skywalker Cup in the Played Every Game tier. Plus, every name you see on your screen right now. You're all awesome and your support means the world to me. Second, this is going to be just like my Elder Scrolls video. In this video, I'll be covering the numbered titles, and in the next video, I'll talk about the spin-offs. Third, this video has a sponsor. I want to thank Keeps for sponsoring this video. So listen, I am a man, and hair loss is definitely a trend among the other men in my family. So, of course, I try to stay on top of, keeping my hair. In fact, 2 out of 3 guys will experience hair loss by the time they're 35, and I'm not there yet, but I am rapidly heading that way. While I've heard of all kinds of home remedies, I want something that I can confidently use that I've seen results from. That's where Keeps comes in. Keeps is a subscription service that helps men keep their hair. With their affordable plans, the treatments are delivered straight to your door. Keeps offers clinically proven treatments backed by research to help stop hair loss and improve your hair growth. Plus, Keeps has a network of medical advisors and care specialists available to help you 24/7. And on top of that, Keeps physicians will help you get the right products for your unique situation and hair goals. Hair loss stops with Keeps. To get 50% off your first order, go to keeps.com/neosci or click the link in the description. That's keeps.com/neosci. Thanks to Keeps for sponsoring this video. Alright, without further ado, let's get into the games. Fallout, a post-nuclear role-playing game, was released in 1997 for home computers. This game is set in a future where a nuclear apocalypse has already happened. So right off the bat, visually, this game is overwhelmingly grimy and aged, and that's the point. Every single location, environment, and character, to an extent, looks like it's been through the ringer. My favorite thing about this game is its visual style, actually, because it adds to the tone and storytelling without having to explicitly tell you. You can tell something is old and weathered just by looking at it. Everything has a story. For example, in almost every settlement you go to, you can immediately tell what kind of people you'll encounter. See a bunch of nice, even stone buildings? You're probably in a fairly civilized place. See a bunch of dilapidated, overgrown buildings without any real attempts to make them livable, but they are armored? You're either in an uninhabited waste or you're about to run into a nasty enemy, or just some unfriendly characters. Another great detail is how this game has a D&D-esque text description for nearly every environment and item that you interact with. It's at the bottom of the screen, and sometimes you can miss it, but all it does is add to the excellent tone set by this game's world and storytelling. Something else this game does is use a faux 3D look for the character dialogue. What I mean by that is that sometimes you'll get a conversation tree with an important character who has this talking portrait, and while it's an animated in 2D thing, it was obviously converted from 3D. There's even full voice acting for these characters, and it's pretty good, even by today's standards. I think this is really charming, and while it's a product of its time, it's something I still really enjoy. And the writing, for what it is also generally decent across the entire game. I do have more to say about the visual identity of this game and the second game, but I'll talk about that more when I talk about Fallout 2. One thing I want to mention before moving on, though, is that while I will be mentioning the oppressive tone of these games a lot, I just need you to know that it's all undercut by some wacky, self-aware dystopian humor through and through. All of these games have some absolutely hilarious elements, and it becomes even more funny when you consider the complete tonal dissonance from the world surrounding these elements. Anyways, let's talk about the actual gameplay. Starting right off the bat, you get the classic War never changes scene. Every main game has at least some mention of this iconic line. The dialogue here is expertly written and describes how the world came to its current state, including international politics like the US annexing Canada, and world powers competing for resources, leading to nuclear annihilation on all sides in 2077. When you're creating your character, you can first choose your name, age, and gender. Then you can modify your special stats, special being an acronym for strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, agility, and luck. After you've selected your special stats, you can also choose your skills and traits. Skills are your overall specialties that allow you to perform in-game actions or affect your overall affinity for using certain weapons and items. Traits are stat boosts that usually also have a downside, like Gifted, a trait that increases all of your special stats at the cost of a minus 10% decrease of your skill levels and an additional penalty to skill points when you level up. The skill system is, to my knowledge, in every single Fallout game from here out. This is the foundation of how every Fallout game's systems work. After character creation, it's then explained that there are survivors of the nuclear apocalypse, and some of them can be found in underground vaults. Every vault has a number designation, and your character is a descendant living in Vault 13. In the Fallout universe, the big overarching story here is that a lot of these vaults were created for the purpose of hosting human experiments, some inhumane, but that's more of a slow burn of a reveal. This game's story isn't quite as big on scale though. For this game, long story short, the vault is running out of water due to a mechanical malfunction, and you're sent out into the wasteland to find a replacement water chip. Because of this, the game actually has a hard time limit for this initial quest. If you can't find the water chip in a certain number of days, it's game over. However, once you do find the chip, the time limit is removed and you can relax a little. Anyways, now that the character is created, you can move on to the actual game. You start just outside the vault and can technically do whatever you want now. Unfortunately, there's that pesky time limit, and the game definitely reminds you all the time of the ever-impending doom of your vault and its people. Real quick, let me explain how the gameplay here actually works. Almost everything you can do in this game can be done exclusively with the mouse. This game is isometric, meaning that everything is viewed at an angle from above. You can click where you want to go at any time, and double-clicking allows you to sprint. There's buttons to access your inventory, Pip-Boy, which I'll explain later, character stats, and the main menu to save and load. If you click and hold on any person, item, or environmental object, you access a contextual menu. In this menu, you can choose to loot an item, talk to a person, or use one of your skills. Using a skill will have varying degrees of success depending on your actual skill level and a dice roll. For example, you can try to steal from someone, but depending on your skill level, you may not always get away with it. In fact, failing to skill will probably get you thrust into combat. Speaking of combat, when moving across these maps, sometimes you'll encounter hostile enemies that will stop you right in your tracks and initiate combat. In combat, every action you take, from movement to attacks to reloading your weapons, depletes your action points, which are determined by your agility stat. Once you're out of action points, you end your turn, and the enemies and any companions take their turns. Both you and the enemies are beholden to this action point system, and that's the core of the game. Fighting enemies works the same regardless of what weapon you're using, but every weapon has a different effective range and different potency based on your stats. When you want to attack an enemy, you can actually see the percentage chance that you'll hit them. Just because you're standing right in front of an enemy doesn't mean you're guaranteed to hit them with a melee weapon. Either way, combat for the most part is pretty straightforward. When you defeat an enemy, you can usually loot them to pick up whatever items they have. When it's an animal or creature, you can typically harvest their meat. Humans, on the other hand, usually have random items or currency. As far as other interactions, you can usually search various things for items, including pretty much anything that could be considered a container. When navigating the maps, you can move your mouse to the edge of the screen to see further away, but your character can only move so far, at least as far as I've played. The overworld map works a little bit differently from the main area maps, like the settlements. The entire world is broken up into squares on a grid, and every square contains a small terrain map. As you travel across the world, you can choose to explore these terrain maps or just move along. Sometimes though, you will be stopped and forced into one of these terrain maps by a random event. These can be enemy encounters, traveling traders, or just random NPCs or events that are happening. As you find new locations, these locations will show up on your map menu, allowing you to easily travel back to them automatically, though you do still have to watch your character manually move across the map and deal with any encounters along the way. The map is actually fairly large though, especially for how old this game is. While the general terrain areas aren't super varied, it's still cool that there's sometimes stuff to find even in unassuming terrain squares. On the other hand though, there is a lot of emptiness, but I guess that can technically be justified by the game's setting. So look, I know that this game has its hardcore fans, and I respect that. That being said, I just could not make myself enjoy this game. Before anyone gets mad and goes straight to the comments, hear me out. I can see that this is a groundbreaking game with some really solid role-playing elements. It's also what set the foundation for what is now a legendary series of games, but this gameplay style has been iterated on to a significant degree, and for me, it just feels clunky to play. The presentation and storytelling are fantastic, especially for the time, but again, the gameplay just suffers. I can handle the way combat works here, but what I can't seem to come to grips with is how sluggish it all feels. It's methodical in a way that I'm sure would be enjoyed by a hardcore old school RPG kind of person, but again, I just can't make myself enjoy enjoy it. Like, take this for example. I was exploring one of the earlier segments of the game where you're exploring Vault 15. I was really excited to check out the big multi-layered map, but what ended up happening was I would go down a level and then immediately get grinded to a halt because I ran into a bunch of super weak enemies. The feeling of exploration is just stunted for me. While I understand that this is part of the game, it's one of those things that I just don't enjoy. I guess it's a flow thing. But again, the game is definitely overall a good game. I mean, it's obviously a fantastic game. It's just not for me. And while I am about to talk about Fallout 2 and expand my thoughts a little bit, I warn you that it's very similar in gameplay and visual style. So I'm not sure that my opinion is going to change. But let's power through and talk about it nonetheless. Fallout 2 was released in 1998 for home computers. This game seems legendary in gaming circles and like one of the greatest games ever made, depending on who you ask. It took the world, story, and writing from the first Fallout and expanded it significantly. Set a few decades after the first game, Fallout 2 sees a descendant of the main character from the first game leaving the settlement that the legendary hero established after their exile at the end of the first game in order to save their people. So listen, I'm gonna say something that I'm sure is very controversial to hardcore Fallout fans. This game, in my opinion, is mechanically and visually identical to Fallout 1. When I moved from Fallout 1 to Fallout 2, I felt like I was playing the same game. In fact, my capture software actually recognized Fallout 2 as the same game, and I didn't have to switch any settings. But the systems are the same, the controls are the same, the general gameplay loop is the same. It's all just expanded and done arguably better or worse, depending on who you ask. I mean, there are updated UI elements and higher production values, but foundationally, this is more of the same. That's not a bad thing at all, especially if you liked the first game. I would just be lying to you if I told you that this game was significantly different in any way. A couple of the mechanical differences I did notice were pretty minor, like characters moving out of your way when you walk past them, and also just having the ability to move your character clear across a map. Just general little quality of life things, but nothing especially huge. As for my broad opinions, Fallout 2 is different in that it has significantly better writing off the bat, at least in my opinion. The dialogue options feel a lot more thought out, and the character interactions are just inherently more interesting. That's not to say Fallout 1's writing was bad by any measure. I just feel like Fallout 2 allowed the writers to really stretch their legs, especially since there was no need to re-establish how this world works. They were able to focus purely on character interactions and world building, which is something that this game, like the first game, completely nails. Mood and tone-wise, this game evokes the exact same feelings, just on a somewhat larger scale. The world map is also way larger than the Fallout 1 map, and while a lot of it is just sort of empty like the first game, there's still all kinds of random events that you can encounter in the wasteland. When you start this game, you start in roughly the same kind of scenario as the first game too, just remixed a bit. You're sent out to find something to save your people. You're even wearing the Vault 13 jumpsuit. I know there's a story reason for it, but I can't help but to point it out. I know that the first two games are beloved, and I'm fully prepared for a storm in the comments. And before anyone says I just didn't give them enough time, or something along those lines, I need to note that I have attempted to play the first two games multiple times over the years, and I've just never been able to enjoy their admittedly unique style of gameplay, at least not in this form. And it's weird because these games have pretty much everything else I enjoy about video games in them, with the character interactions, freedom to experiment with the mechanics, and all of that. It's just that the core gameplay itself doesn't click with me. I'm sure there are mods out there that would tailor the experience to something more enjoyable for me, but that's not what this video is about. Something that I've learned making these videos is that not every game is for everyone, and that's fine. People have unique tastes, and that gives the world a lot more variety. That being said, I still think every game has some kind of redeeming quality regardless of my personal taste, and both this and the first Fallout have a lot of redeeming qualities. But I'm getting off track. Overall, for Fallout 2, the top tier writing and unique visual style definitely sets both this and the first game apart from other isometric adventure games from this era, and I completely understand why they're so beloved. If you like this gameplay style or can look past it to enjoy the things beyond the gameplay, I can recommend both Fallout 1 and 2. Unfortunately for me, those things can't be fully appreciated because I just can't enjoy the gameplay. Fortunately for me though, the series changed hands to another developer after this, and that developer put their own unique spin on it. Let's take a look. Fallout 3 was developed by Bethesda Game Studios and released in 2008 for PC and consoles. Before I move into this game and Fallout 4, I just want to preface it by saying that I'm playing with all of the DLC installed for both games. This game obviously was the first released after Bethesda gained the rights to the franchise, and oh boy did they come out swinging. This game was my, and probably a lot of people's, first Fallout game, and what made me fall in love with the series. So let's get this part out of the way first. This game uses the exact same engine as the Elder Scrolls games. In fact, this game shares a lot of its identity with modern Elder Scrolls games, which makes sense because it comes from the same developers, and mechanically, it's a very similar gameplay style, at least on the surface. If you want to see more about that, check out my video where I played every Elder Scrolls game. Visually and thematically, though, it's a different story. This game manages to absolutely nail the kind of visual style you'd expect from a Fallout game in 3D. Everything still looks grimy, old, dilapidated, and wrecked. While the visuals of the characters haven't aged super well, they still look perfectly acceptable. The world is vast and beautiful in its own way, with all kinds of locations to find, people to meet, and enemies to confront. The gameplay in Fallout 3 is a huge departure from the first two games. This game is a first or third person action role-playing game. You could technically call it a shooter, but you could also, in theory, do an entire playthrough without firing a gun once. In fact, I'm sure plenty of people have done just that. The intro to this game brings back the War never changes monologue and has a really cool thematic sequence where it slowly reveals the kind of world the game takes place in. After the introduction sequence, the game starts with you as a baby and goes into character creation. Sorry for all the comparisons, but it's similar to how Elder Scrolls handles it. You choose from a variety of face options, and then you can manually adjust facial features with sliders. Then you can choose hairstyles and colors. Rather than just immediately throwing you into the wasteland like previous games, this game does something a little different and allows you to grow up in Vault 101. You start as a toddler, and through a few time skips, you can see what your character's life is like in your interactions with your dad. During this time, they also throw a couple of really creative ways of having you choose your special stats and your skills. The special stats are chosen from a children's book, and skills are done through an exam given to the Vault Dwellers as teenagers. Of course, you can also manually choose your stats too. This is actually really similar to previous Fallout games, since the stats are essentially the same. After a number of story events, culminating with the disappearance of your dad, you end up being forced to leave the vault, and once you're outside, you go out into the world free to do whatever you like. And I mean that. In these games, you can tackle things in whatever order you want. In fact, you can completely ignore the main story quests outright if you want. Now, I mentioned the Pip-Boy when I was talking about the first Fallout, but it seems like there's a lot more emphasis placed on the Pip-Boy in the modern games. The Pip-Boy is a wrist-mounted computer that almost every Vault Dweller has. In the first two games, the Pip-Boy was essentially another part of the menus and had various functions like maps. In the modern Fallout games, the Pip-Boy takes a much larger role in that almost every menu uses the Pip-Boy's interface. Inventory, stats, maps, and even a radio can be found in the Pip-Boy menu. The only menus that aren't Pip-Boy based are contextual menus and the system menu. In this game, you have the option to run around in first or third person, but I prefer first person. Combat works like any average adventure game. You can fire your gun, or throw a projectile at enemies, or hit them with a melee weapon. The accuracy and damage of these weapons depends on how high your stat with that weapon type is, though. However, where this and future Fallout games set themselves apart is the VATS system. VATS is like a marriage between the modern gameplay style and the classic action points based gameplay style. In VATS, you can target any living ally or enemy, preferably enemies, and choose which individual limbs you want to aim for. When you initiate VATS, time slows down to a halt, and you can highlight any body part to aim for. When you highlight a body part, you can see your chance of hitting them in the form of a percentage, along with roughly how much HP you'll hit them for. You can choose to fire however many times you like, but every time you do, you use up action points. It's like an evolution of the system in previous games, and it works really well. It's a lot of fun trying to hit criticals on enemies and watching their heads just kinda pop off. Sometimes, aiming for a specific limb can cripple that limb. Say, for example, you shoot the arm that an enemy is using to hold a weapon. If you cripple the arm, there's a chance they'll drop the weapon, but their accuracy is also severely impacted. Of course, you can also be crippled in any limb, too, leading to various ill effects like a loss of accuracy, slow movement speed, and outright stat penalties. Using the Pip-Boy, you can actually heal individual limbs using stim packs, the trademark healing item in this game. The Pip-Boy also houses the equipment menus, and here you can equip any apparel and weapons that you've collected. What's cool is that there's actually all kinds of gear in this game, and it's all visually distinct. See someone wearing a hat that you really want? You pretty much have the freedom to assassinate them and take it if you want to. When you defeat an enemy wearing armor, you can actually loot the armor off of them and wear it yourself. I guess one size fits all in the way Wasteland. I don't know exactly where to include this, but this game introduces a new mechanic in the form of waiting. This is clearly something that was taken from the Elder Scrolls games, but it works really well for Fallout 2. Using this mechanic allows you to wait up to 24 hours in-game. That's it. While that normally sounds kinda useless, it becomes more clear as to why it's important when you see how NPCs work in this game. This game uses Radiant AI, Bethesda's AI system. To put it into simple terms, it gives every NPC their own life schedule. Characters will go home and go to bed at certain times, shops will only be open at certain hours, and some events are only accessible during certain hours. This is one of those things that greatly increases immersion in a role-playing game like this, and I think it naturally fits into the Fallout universe, so I'm glad Bethesda brought it over. Something that I haven't mentioned yet is this series' buff items. These come in the form of alcohol and chems. These appear in every single game. Usually these items will give you a temporary stat boost, sometimes making certain previously inaccessible actions actually possible. These effects are temporary though. Of course, with the upside also comes a downside. Usually there's a penalty to another stat. On top of that, you can also overuse these items and become addicted. Being addicted to chems will cause withdrawal if you don't keep steadily taking them. And while there are various ways of curing the addiction, they don't go away on their own. Something I really want to focus on here is the way that Fallout 3, and by extension future Fallout games, handle quests. So in true Bethesda fashion, sometimes quests will just fall into your lap. You'll be exploring an area and an NPC will just run up to you and ask for help, or you'll see some kind of note or lore piece that indicates something that you can find somewhere else on the world map. But then there's also grander quests that can unfold in a ridiculous number of ways. Here's an example of the awesome way that a quest can unfold, and it's probably one of the most infamous quests in this game. While exploring the capital Wasteland, you'll probably come across a small city called Megaton. This city is a huge scrap of metal with an undetonated atomic bomb right in the center of it. Mind you, this bomb still has the capacity to blow up, it just hasn't yet. When you arrive in Megaton, you can tell the town sheriff that you're willing to disarm the bomb, and if your science skill is high enough, you can do just that and allow the people in the city to live without fear of the bomb ever detonating. However, there is an unscrupulous fellow in Megaton named Mr. Burke, who asks you to rig the bomb to explode for a reward. Now, from here, you can do a number of things. If you haven't already disarmed the bomb, you can take the pulse charge from him and give it to the town sheriff and run to arrest Mr. Burke. And it even branches from there, as Mr. Burke will try to kill the sheriff. You can stop him, or you can just let it happen. However, you can also just not tell the sheriff at all and rig the bomb to explode. Then you can travel all the way to a place called Tenpenny Tower and watch the bomb explode in a glorious show of fire and destruction, taking Megaton and its people permanently off the map. As a reward, you get a really nice suite in the tower where you can sleep, decorate, and store your items. I'm sure there's even more possible outcomes to this quest, and this game has a few quests with these kinds of branching outcomes, which makes it incredibly immersive and gives it a ton of replay value. This is especially true since every moral action you take in these games affects your karma. Now, let me point out that both of the previous Fallout games had branching missions and karma values, but the spectacle is unmatched when you compare it to Fallout 3's implementation. Karma does exist in all of these games though. It affects not only people's general perception of you, but also conversation choices, quests you can take on, and even whether or not certain companions will follow you. Outside of quests, things that affect karma include stealing, killing characters that aren't hostile, and a number of other things. Blowing up Megaton, by the way, instant maximum negative karma. You just become evil instantly. There are perks and stuff later on that can change or even reset your karma, but those don't really come into play until the end game or even the post-end game. Another constant among these games is a specific companion that you can get, and his name is Dogmeat. He appears in every, at least mainline game. He's a dog, he fights for you, and you can tell him he's a good boy. What more could you ask for? Something else that this game does really well is the interaction with the environment and NPCs. Nearly every item you see in this game is a real item that you can interact with. This means that you can pick it up and put it into your inventory, or you can crouch behind somebody and hide and try to steal it. While this game doesn't feature any really heavy crafting mechanics, there is a blueprint system. Sometimes you'll randomly find blueprints for weapons while exploring, and if you take these blueprints to a workbench, you can build the weapon in question. Usually, you'll need a few random bits of junk to fully put it together. Unfortunately, a lot of the junk you find does still seem entirely useless outside of, tossing it into the rocket launcher. A secondary crafting mechanic, if you can call it that, is the ability to repair weapons and armor. As you use weapons and armor, their durability will slowly degrade over time, affecting their stats considerably. However, if you have a similar weapon or even the same weapon of a lower durability, you can combine them to repair the item. This is a nice use for all the duplicate guns and gear that you're bound to find over time. So, Fallout Fallout 3 is interesting because it introduced so many new elements, but it also clearly borrowed a lot from the Elder Scrolls. Even so, the way these mechanics seamlessly fit into the world made Fallout 3 better. It literally brought new perspective to the series and, of course, began this new era of Fallout games. Fallout 4 was released in 2015 for PC and consoles, so this game does something that no other Fallout game ever did, and that's making the player character a voiced protagonist with their own preset personality. This was a huge dividing point amongst fans of the series. I mean, some people look at these games as a self-insert of sorts, where you take on the role of your character and become that character. This is a lot harder to do when the character has their own voice and personality right out the gate. While it did make some of the story beats more interesting, it also made it feel more like a game where you're playing as a character rather than as yourself. The story actually starts before the bombs go off. You play as either the male or female player character who have an infant son in their suburban home. The male player character even narrates the
War. War never changes.
However, as the bombs start to drop, the family is led to Vault 111 for safety. Unfortunately for them, Vault 111's whole purpose is to unwittingly put its residents in cryogenic stasis for an indefinite amount of time. At some point, your son is kidnapped and your spouse is killed, only for you to get refrozen. Finally, some intentionally obscured amount of time later, you escape your stasis and venture out into the unrecognizable wasteland you once called home, with the goal of finding your kidnapped son, Sean. Visually, this game does something that I didn't think was possible until I played it on its release day, and that's taking the destroyed, run-down look of Fallout's wasteland and making it colorful. Like, everything here is vivid and pops in a way unlike any previous Fallout game. Fallout 3 had this grimy brown look to it, and while I'm not going to talk about New Vegas until the spin-offs video, I can say that New Vegas wasn't even this colorful. Don't get me wrong, it's still got the run-down brown rust and grime that we've all come to love, but it strikes a great balance of managing to not be entirely devoid of color. I actually love this aesthetic, and I think it meshes really well with the grit and grime look. Honestly, I think that I could say that I even prefer this look. Of course, the actual visuals are, in general, a lot better than the previous games, including texture details, animations, models, and environments. This game also has a huge presentation upgrade over the previous games in a lot of ways too. In fact, the first few things I noticed were that the characters' mouth movements are a lot closer to what they're actually saying, and the game uses a more cinematic camera for NPC dialogue. There's even fun little details like being able to see your character flipping switches and pressing buttons as you interact with the Pip-Boy. As for gameplay, right off the bat, everything in this game just feels snappier, and there's a ton of quality of life improvements. The menus feel more responsive in general, you can now loot without opening up a separate menu, and they've even added the ability to sprint using AP. They also added more FPS-style sights to most of the guns, and the ability to use a melee attack with the gun itself, including a cool takedown animation sometimes. Now, this does make this game tread dangerously close to leaving the balanced CRPG style it's been known for, but I personally believe it still is firmly a solid Fallout game, at least mechanically. The only negative aspect to these combat changes, in my opinion, is that VATS definitely feels a little less useful when you have dedicated weapon sights that give you pretty good accuracy. While your aim isn't by any means perfect, it is still pretty good with the standard sights. Anyways, leveling up and perks, while functioning mostly the same under the hood, now has a completely different presentation. Everything is now on this big branching board where you can boost your special stats and unlock a ton of perks, some of which actually interface with the new game systems. While waiting is still in this, it's been changed in that you now have to be sitting down or sleeping to pass time. You can't initiate a wait if you're standing or otherwise somewhere where there isn't any seating. This, in my opinion, is actually a positive change. I find myself using the wait mechanic a lot in these games, especially to avoid traveling at night. This added barrier to using wait really makes you actually have to go outside your comfort zone and travel at all times of the day if you're just out in the wasteland. So the way this game handles dialogue is a pretty significant departure from every previous game, and this was a very divisive change. Rather than showing you exactly what your character will say on a dialogue tree, you instead now have 4 options of dialogue that are basically just paraphrased. It looks kind of like Mass Effect. This means that while you can choose what to say, you can't actually know for sure what the other options actually were. On top of that, you'll sometimes choose an option that leads to your character saying something completely unexpected. They also reworked the skill checks. Now if you want to use choose a skill-based dialogue option, you can see the chance of it succeeding based on the color of the dialogue option. I respect them experimenting with trying to shake up the dialogue formula of these games, but I definitely think this was a misfire, and so does Todd Howard. I don't really think it needed any fixing or changing. There are mods that bring it more in line with the classic Fallout dialogue, but we'll save the modding discussion for some other time. VATS has been reworked slightly here. Mechanically, it's pretty much the same, but instead of completely stopping time, it now just slows down time while you select your targets. Additionally, as you hit enemies in VATS, you charge a critical gauge that, when filled, allows you to enable a critical hit guaranteed. This new version of VATS isn't a huge difference, but honestly, I prefer this since it kinda gives you a sense of urgency, and it forces you to take more on-the-spot decisions since you're not outright freezing time. The way gear is handled is a bit different from previous entries too. Instead of equipping a certain type of armor as your entire armor kit, you now have different modular armor pieces for each limb. This means that you can mix and match armor pieces and have more direct control over your character's appearance than ever. However, the trade-off here is that sometimes it can be kind of obnoxious to find that last piece of an armor kit that you already have everything else for, especially if you somehow forgot to pick it up the first time. A brand new mechanic is that this game added a much deeper crafting system, allowing you to put weapons and armor on a workbench and mod them by changing their sights, stocks, and grips, or just adding things to them like a blade to a lead pipe. I really like this system because not only does it add a layer of complexity to an already complex game, it gives you something tangible that you can do with all the otherwise useless junk you find in the wasteland. Something else you can use the junk for is an entirely new, unique workshop system that has you basically building an entire settlement in your own creative vision using the resources from the junk. When you're at your settlements, you can access a menu that allows you to place, move, and manipulate items, furniture, structures, and interactables. A lot of it is also kind of a simulation game where you're assigning settlers to do certain jobs like farming and trying to increase their happiness. Occasionally while you're away, the settlement will get attacked and you can go back and defend it. There's also multiple unlockable settlements. If you find a workbench, that's a settlement you can create, though sometimes you do have to clear it out from raiders. These new systems were an awesome addition to my opinion. First off, they're almost entirely optional, so if you don't like them or don't want to engage with them, you don't really have to. But in my opinion, it's really cool to always have something you're building as you wander the wasteland in this game, collecting all kinds of junk that can be refined into materials to make your settlement more and more grand and advanced. While I wasn't able to build anything crazy for this video due to the sheer amount of time it would take, I have seen some absolutely bonkers settlements that others have built. This game would have been completely fine without this new element, but the settlements just elevate this game to new heights, and I really hope the next game brings this back in some form. Oh, and this game entirely did away with weapon durability, but I think that's for the best since juggling that system with the new systems would probably lead to a more tedious experience overall. One last thing I want to mention about the gameplay with this game, and it's really my only big gripe, is that coming from the previous games, I got used to a constantly oppressive and threatening world. In Fallout 4 though, there's this general sense of ease. Like yeah, there's still a bunch of enemies including creatures, raiders, etc. in the wasteland, but it feels like there's less of them somehow. But on top of that, it seems almost like a lot of these characters just kinda like you right off the bat, or at the very least are more receptive to you. In previous games, the characters didn't seem so friendly. In fact, most of them were just hostile. Maybe this has to do with the character having a voice and a personality and more of a role in the story? I don't know. The atmosphere is still great and it's not by any means a deal breaker, but I still feel like it needed to be pointed out. So the final thing I want to touch on in this game is mods. It's widely known that Fallout games and Bethesda games in general are huge in the modding scene. These games have thousands, if not tens of thousands of mods made for them. In Fallout 4, this hasn't changed, but what has changed is that there's now an in-game mod browser. This means that you can install mods for this game without ever leaving the game itself, and this feature can be found in the main menu on the title screen. While most of the most popular mods are still only available on third-party websites, the fact that Bethesda embraces mods in this way is always super awesome, and modding Bethesda games will always be a really fun chore. So overall, my opinion on Fallout 4 is actually largely positive. I know this game has its detractors, but I can also say anecdotally that most people I know who enjoy Fallout also enjoy Fallout 4. The improvements to the already existing systems and the quality of life boosts already would have made this a cool game, but the beautifully colorful world and the addition of brand new systems like the settlements really pushed this to what I'd consider a great game. While I do think the story is a bit lackluster compared to previous games, along with me feeling kinda iffy on the approach to dialogue options, I still can wholeheartedly recommend this game. And that's it for the main series of Fallout games. Now listen, there's bound to be a ton of stuff I didn't get to talk about in this video. These games are incredibly dense and there's so much to find, and while I'd love to talk about everything, it would probably make for an excessively long video. The goal here is to make a broad overview of these games though, and I think I covered the biggest elements. Fallout itself is just such a good series, and it's one of those series that has shockingly few mainline titles when you look at it as a whole. In fact, there are way more spin-offs and side games than there are main games. The next I Played Every Game video will be the Fallout spin-offs, so definitely keep an eye out for that. The original plan was to play them all in one video, but I decided that I wanted to keep this more in line with my Elder Scrolls videos for consistency. Anyways, I'm rambling. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a fantastic day.